Welcome to Savills Shares, the podcast, where we talk about real estate. I'm Jacke Chye, your host, and today we have Simon Raper, head of Savills Design. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you, Jack. Good to be here.
I read an interesting story about the origins of workplace strategy, that in 1985, Philip Stone and Robert Luchetti declared in the Harvard Business Review that your office is where you are. Is that what workplace strategy is all about?
Well, kind of, but I think a lot of people would argue that the Frank Duffy group of DGW in 1991 were probably founders of workplace strategy, but definitely those guys were on to something. I started in 1988 and definitely it was more of a design-led approach back then. But really it's about marrying people, place, and technology together these days. But back then, it was really trying to understand what the workplace and business requirements were for an organization, and then trying to match that and enable that with a workplace with the staff and making sure that they were as effective as possible. So it was very much driven around the optimization of work processes and workplaces together. Whereas today, it's much more around the people, the place, and the technology.
One of the interesting design facts that I've learned is this 3-meter ceiling. Can you expound on that for our audience?
That's a good one, Jack. So the 3-meter ceiling really talks about something we call the cathedral effect. So basically, people, when they walk into an office, they're working in an office, and you've got a 3-meter or higher ceiling, it tends to kind of foster the psychology around more creative thinking, more open thinking, and more collaboration in the way that people behave. And then a ceiling that's lower than 3 meters can often sort of encourage more critical thinking and more concentrative, detail-orientated type work. What studies have found over the last 20 years, more from the kind of psychology of work, is that actually when you have a 3-meter or higher ceiling, you tend to find actually there's a reduced number of sick leave. So actually, when we look at studies we've done in Asia Pacific in the last, say, 10 years, there is actually a direct correlation. So for Savills, for example, since we did our office here, we opened up the ceiling, obviously during the pandemic. As we've come back, we've actually been monitoring our sick leave, and that's declined over the time that we've been back into this new office. Now, some of that is the placebo effect. People just feel that the office is more open, like you've got space to breathe, and you feel more comfortable. And then some of it is obviously mechanical services. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, where we're based, heat rises. And so when people are coughing and germs are coming out, that tends to be recirculating at a higher level. So therefore, not directly in people's kind of field of view. So they're not breathing those things in. And obviously, then we've implemented better kind of mechanical services and ventilation as part of that project. But generally, it's, I guess I would say it's truly really an unknown. I think it's more of that kind of psychological aspects, but it's been proven over many scientific studies over the last 20 plus years.
Right. So what role does workplace design play in the whole equation of work-life balance?
That's a good one, Jack. If I'm really honest, I'm not sure it does. I think that the workplace design these days, we're creating and designing spaces that are more around wellness and well-being, and obviously kind of trying to promote that for users when they're in those spaces. But ultimately, if you talk about the work-life balance, it's usually driven by the culture of an organization and also the individual. So ultimately, how you choose to run your kind of activities and where you work and how you work and how much time you actually spend working is very much like an individual kind of process, and is obviously driven by the culture of the organization. So for example, we've heard a lot of people talk about, since they've had this flexibility and choice, the ability to work from anywhere or work from home, they're actually working longer hours because there's no kind of commute in the middle to kind of switch off and switch on. And I found that myself, like working from home, I ended up doing easily 10, 12 hours a day. And obviously that's not the work-life balance. So what we're seeing is that work-life balance, for some people, it depends on their home circumstances as well. But for a lot of people, we're now starting to see some people come back to the office in higher groups. And I think that's because for older generation like myself, a Generation X, we sort of get up, we've got that commute to the office, that we're then sort of in the mindset of working, we work for a full day, then we've got that commute home, and then that's kind of our then sort of decompression time, and then we're kind of into our home life. So that's how I kind of manage my work-life balance. But I think that the younger generation are finding that maybe easier to control if you're in a Gen Z, because obviously you've been born into this kind of digital enabled kind of place from day one. And so they've sort of learned how to manage that sort of on and off piece in that digital space. But I think for like millennials, they're the ones that are really struggling with that work-life balance, and particularly because they tend to have young families as well.
So does that mean that design can't address that for the millennials?
Yeah, I think like it's, we try to design spaces that kind of give places for people to kind of work and do different activities that kind of support their mental well-being, etc. Decompression spaces. We've got areas now in offices where there's like totally no tech. So you go in and there's no Wi-Fi signal, nothing. You go in there and it's almost like a really quiet kind of old school library type space. But ultimately, it's just really to kind of bring that well-being within the office when you're there. But actually, the work-life balance really is a personal control thing.
It's interesting that you spoke about the right tech, which is actually an important component of workplace strategy. How does having the right tech or employing it play into the whole effectiveness of workplace strategy?
I think that tech has a huge place within the modern workplace. There's different aspects to it. So in terms of attracting talent and bringing people back to the office, having the right kind of technology or having new technology that people can't access or utilize whilst at home or working from a third space really helps to bring people in. And that technology usually is around the ability to kind of maybe collaborate with your colleagues and teams in a different way, or to utilize different kind of tools, maybe large format screens and things that you couldn't ordinarily access from a remote location. The other side of it from a business perspective is looking at things like desk booking, room booking systems that allow you to kind of make sure you can kind of get to sit with the right people when you come into a space. You can find your colleagues, you can sit with your colleagues. Maybe you don't want to sit with your colleagues, you want a quiet time when you come into that space. But also like the analytics and the data side of that, sort of looking at how to track and the utilization of space. So really kind of helping us to understand more than ever before how people are actually using space, how they move around the space. I think that the technology also has a huge part to play in the attraction and retention of new talent. So, I think by 2030, some people have said that like 50% of the population, particularly in Asia, is going to be Gen Z, the tech-enabled kind of generation. And so they're really demanding much more from that kind of workplace technology. So, for example, like in our meeting spaces, when we redid our office, we had to kind of work really hard to kind of create the ability to one click and go. So you walk into any of our meeting rooms and you can literally click one button and you can connect in with any kind of device, whether it's Apple, Windows, and then also our kind of like the human experience or the workplace experience, the customer experience piece. When people come in, we've got a QR code to check in, which was historical from the kind of pandemic times. But what that does is then text or emails that individual as guest the Wi-Fi code, and then they can click on that and immediately they connected their devices. They're all connected to the kind of local network for the guests, and then when they walk into the room, they can also one click and go into that. And that's really kind of creating that seamless technology, I think, is one of the most important things, because if it's difficult, like it used to be, lots of cables here, there, and everywhere, then you're really going, sort of going backwards. I think people are really looking for that workplace experience to be much better than it used to be, and that can be touching a lot of different points. But technology is a huge point within that.
Now, the other component that is important for workplace strategy is the focus on collaboration and culture. But how does one actually execute something as intangible as culture?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I think like what we're seeing is that the modern workplace strategy would really be a deep dive into understanding an organization. So we start with understanding the organization, the culture, the leadership. And as you go through that, we build out what we call personas. That's basically workplace personas for individuals. that can then maybe categorize into groups. And through those personas, we get a deep understanding of the kind of the nature, the psychology of the people, but also how they work, what they need to work. And then that helps us kind of understand the space types, the kind of killer parts, but then also then starts to build up that kind of space model. And then through that, we also go, I guess, we now see that change management, which used to be a separate activity, is really hand in hand, or like hand in glove really these days with what we do. So we talk about workplace strategy and change, or workplace strategy and change management together. So it's really a kind of unified approach, because it's really the kind of, you've got your quantitative and qualitative data, but you really need to understand the people, not just the organization, because actually everything's changed since the pandemic. So the way that people work, the way that people have that flexibility and choice, organizations are really now starting to understand that they have to know more about their people in order to understand that. So, and I think that there's this old analogy that says that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think that's really true. I think we're seeing that there's some amazing organizations we're working with here in Singapore that have had fantastic success in getting some of their staff back to the office. And I wouldn't say all the time or in a huge amounts, but when people come back, they really come back and they're really engaging within the business, and they're really being productive and really connecting with people in a kind of collaborative way. And that's really down to the culture of the organization that's really kind of built that within the businesses. We're seeing some organizations where maybe their culture isn't quite as strong, and they've had challenges in getting people back, but they've also had challenges with staff retention. So people when we've done surveys and workshops with their colleagues, we found that some of those people sort of feel disconnected to the organization. They don't feel loyal anymore to that organization because they kind of had this kind of disparate experience while they were disconnected, if you like, during the sort of pandemic, particularly during the circuit break where everybody's kind of locked in at home. So I think that sort of strong culture of an organization has a huge part to play. And then when people are coming back into the office, this goes back to the technology piece. I think that the kind of connectivity of people are coming back not to sit at a desk really 8 hours a day anymore to kind of just sit and do that individual focused work. They're coming back to do the team type work. And I think that we've also seen a shift towards more team orientated activities. So those organizations that seem to be thriving have really kind of sort of almost like rewritten the rule book or rewritten their kind of internal organizational matrix of how they deliver work. So people are delivering work in teams in pairs or threes or sixes. And those people are coming back together and collaborating and maybe going into project team rooms. They're using that technology to kind of connect in different ways. Of course, they're still doing individual work, but they're choosing to do that maybe in a third space or working from home where there's less distractions. But if you think about your own sort of daily activities, I'm in Teams calls like at least 50% of the day, every day. I could do those from anywhere. I choose to come into the office to do them because they've got amazing technology. I can go sit in a phone booth. I can go and sit in a phone room. Whereas if at home you've got like daily things going on around, you've got your young kids running around and things like that, there's lots of distractions. Whereas like I can be much more focused and efficient if I've got the right environment with the right acoustics, the right lighting. So I've got the right mindset to kind of focus and concentrate on those types of work. And also, I thrive in the nature of what I do. I thrive in that kind of team environment, right? So, everything that we do is really the we. So we work together as a team, and I think we can't do that unless we get together. So whilst we have a remote team policy, and my team do work from home, they're working from home to do those individual activities that they need to do. But when we're in the office together, we're here to actually work together and go through stuff together, doing page turns on design reviews, collaborating, maybe running a workshop together, whether it's internally or externally with clients or our own colleagues. So that kind of fostering of that kind of environment is really, really crucial for today's modern workplace.
Right. The tripartite guidelines for flexible work arrangements was launched recently and will be effective from 1st of December onwards.
Yeah.
How will that change workplace and workspace?
I think what the government's actually doing is very smart. I think what they realise is that, since the pandemic really has kind of launched or catapulted everybody forward. Definitely we saw people working from home and working from a third space before. And I won't say it was like a smaller group, but it was a group, that was like already tech enabled, had all the kind of tools to be able to do that. And maybe it was around people who were kind of sales, marketing, maybe consultants, people who were sort of remote or traveling around anyway. And then the pandemic came along, everybody got this remote or these tools to be able to do mobile working. And it really sort of launched us forward on a trajectory. We're already on, but maybe catapulted us forward like 10 years. But that sudden change for all those kind of white collar workers globally was really a fundamental shift in the way people work for the first time in 100 years. And that's, you can't sort of shy away from that. It truly is a monumental shift. And with that, I think what we've seen is that, and I guess if you think about humans, like if you're forming a new behavior or habit, you need 3 months as a minimum. If you're going to the gym January the 1st, if you're not doing it by April or May or even June, you're going to give up. But if you keep going beyond that, then you'll form a new habit or a new behavior. So of course, the pandemic went from sort of January 2020 through to kind of May 2023. So that's 3 years and 3 months. That's 3 years longer than what you need to kind of change those new behaviors and habits. So definitely people have adapted to that new way of working and that new lifestyle. And some people have been very successful in creating, going back to that earlier question, that work-life balance. And some people are struggling. But I think that everybody would probably agree that kind of more autonomy and more flexibility and choice is not a bad thing. And for most organizations, actually, when they look at their businesses during the pandemic, for the most part, most people have continued to have a good business and not really a huge drop off in productivity. So actually, it's not been the catastrophic sort of disaster that everybody was kind of predicting. So I think that what the Singapore government have gone is, okay, well, this flexibility and choice is here to stay, and I genuinely believe that. So I think what they're trying to do is trying to get ahead of that, in that they're being sensible to say to organizations, of which we're seeing some organizations would prefer to get more staff back in the office more often. And then the other flip side, like technology firms, were flip-flopping backwards and forwards between, everybody can work from home forever, to actually want everybody back into the office. Then, actually, they're starting to see people leave, so then they change their mind again. I think that what they're trying to do is bring the two parties together to have a sensible conversation. Because if you don't do that and you don't get some agreement, then over time, animosity and challenges will start to grow. And then, of course, then that starts to affect businesses, organizations, and ultimately the economy as well. So I think Singapore has done very well in terms of like weathering the storm. And obviously, with the introductions of things like AI and other technologies, new challenges are coming along. We've got through the pandemic, and then the next challenge comes along. So we're seeing that kind of reskilling and them looking at sort of, bringing in these kind of training courses and things for the general population. This is just another sensible measure to try and get the two parties to come together and find the kind of common ground, because I think they understand that this is here to stay and it's a positive thing, but it has to be managed correctly and it needs to be managed with KPIs and things like that. And I think that those organizations that will continue to flourish will embrace that kind of flexibility and choice, and also really support the staff in doing that.
With the Paris Agreement and the Singapore Green Plan 2030 being top of mind, where does sustainability play in the whole concept of workplace design?
Oh, that's very close to my heart. So I feel like it's a huge importance. Obviously, we're doing the right thing for the planet. We're doing the right thing for our future, our planet. But certainly, to go back to that kind of, the healthier workplaces, if you can kind of improve your ESG, so your sustainability, you're not just reducing your costs, in terms of energy consumption, for example, but also you're kind of creating a healthier and a happier environment for your staff to come into. So for some people, some pregnant women don't like to go into offices if they've just been fitted out because they're worried about the smells and things. So if we can create kind of new workplaces and new fit outs using sustainable materials, you don't have those challenges. And so you can then obviously alleviate one of those challenges there. I think that the recycle, reuse and circular is a huge piece of this part to play. So in our office, for example, we took some of the old workstations, which were like 15 years old, and rather than going to landfill or getting incinerated, like which is typically what they do in Singapore, we had those old tops taken away and then made into new tops. And that meant that we reduced our waste down to less than 10% overall on the fit out, which is probably unheard of at the time. And that allowed us to kind of keep a local joinery firm going at the back of the pandemic. They obviously didn't have a huge amount of work to go around. So we're supporting local businesses. We're reducing the time to deliver and execute our own projects because we're using materials here. We're not having to bring them in from overseas. And then obviously travel distance and bringing something in by air freight or by ship is obviously not good for the environment because that's adding to greenhouse gases, etc. So, and then reusing those materials, it allows us to also then come up with bespoke solutions. So that means then we could design lockers that had shoe spaces and things like that. And I think you've seen us doing those office tours around the office now over the last couple of years since we've done that. And we're finding that nearly every client that we engage with on a workplace strategy or a design project, particularly in Southeast Asia, are taking that on board and going, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do that. So, and of course, it's not always the cheapest solution, right? So reusing those workstations and you reusing those tops and recycling the rest of it probably costs us 10% more than just going out and buying new. But it's a great investment, and also it's just the right thing to do. And I think that using green materials and things like that is really enhancing the opportunity for design, recycle, reuse. We're looking at one of our new offices that we're designing at the moment in Malaysia, and we're looking at like engaging the staff in that process. So we're looking at how we can kind of get them to collect plastic bottle caps, which everybody can do at home, and then bring them in, and we're going to compress them and make a new top, which might go onto the reception desk, work surface, or it might be going into the pantry. We haven't decided yet. But that's something then that everybody can be involved in. So yeah, we got involved in that. Then we're looking at how we can kind of create art and sculpture and things like that by engaging the staff and local businesses, but using recycled, upcycled materials from the old office. So again, we're trying to reduce our waste and our impact on the space. I think that the younger generation as well, the Gen Z in particular, obviously they've been born into a period of time where, this is top of mind. We're having all these conversations, and they're really, they are the future, and they demand that we are taking action. We're doing the right thing. And I think that they're really driving that agenda. So recently I was interviewing a new candidate, and of course they asked about things like salary and bonus and things like all the usual stuff. But one of the key questions they asked up front of those was actually, what's our ESG and sustainability charter? What is it we're doing? How are we making an impact? What are we trying to do? Because they looked at us and said, you're Savills, you're in real estate, you cover like commercial, residential, retail, F&B, all these different areas. You have a huge responsibility and a potential huge impact in a positive way on these things, or a negative way if you're not taking that on board. So you could see that they were really passionate about these types of things, and so that's really encouraging for us as we sort of keep going forward and constantly trying to kind of improve what we do.
Now that's fascinating. This plastic bottle cap project in Malaysia, that goes back to reinforce our point about collaboration, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think like what we did with this project in Malaysia is actually get the staff engagement. So people were coming in to drop things off. So that started to, bring people back to the office, and then people were like swapping them, showing what they were doing. They were kind of fostering conversations. And actually we found in an office of just over 100 people, people were actually starting to talk to each other that maybe didn't need to speak to each other before. So you had, it's not a huge office by any stretch of imagination, but those people wouldn't ordinarily be collaborating or talking to each other in the way that they have been doing. So we really sort of see that we kind of fostered this kind of collaboration, this conversation. And I guess ultimately what we're doing is we're building up the community, the culture that we talked about previously. I think we saw in Singapore that we had a strong culture in this office, and that people wanted to come back, and they wanted to get back to kind of socialize with each other, missed each other. We certainly see at lunchtime here in the office, and maybe when people are going out, that people go out in large groups. They like to sit and talk and collaborate and laugh and joke and talk about the stories of, from the weekend with the kids and the families. And that kind of, it's a really warm feeling that you get when you walk through our office at lunchtime and you see that kind of collaboration as community of people together. And I think that's what we're trying to grow there in Malaysia, is to kind of get those people really sort of, building those kind of social elements together, because that ultimately builds really strong, healthy teams. If people don't really know each other, outside of the work, then there isn't really that huge kind of relationship there. But actually, if you truly know each other, you don't have to be living in and out of each other's pockets. But if you really understand other people and you understand their emotions and what's driving them, whether it's family, whether it's individual kind of goals and things like that, you can truly start to collaborate and help each other and work with each other in a stronger way by understanding each other's motivations in that sense. And I think that's something that part of what we do as part of that persona piece I mentioned earlier is really to truly understand what it is that's driving the organization culture as well as individuals, because actually organizations don't change themselves, they change through the individuals. And actually change management is very much about changing individuals. And if you've got 1,000 people, you need to try and change 1,000 people or take them on that journey. You can't do it just with 20, 30 people. It has to be a majority kind of shift.
So Simon, how do you think workplace strategy or design will change in the next 5 or 10 years?
If I had a crystal ball, I think it's very exciting for me. I think I've been in this industry now 36 years. So over the last 3 decades, I must have reinvented myself 4 or 5 times over that time. And I think like now, when I started, I was a designer who was doing strategy but didn't know it at the time because it was in its infancy and it's kind of in the way that it works. We were just kind of doing advanced briefing, design briefing. But I think over the years, we've had to become, or at least understand, human psychology, workplace analytics, data analytics. There's a sort of a huge kind of shift in terms of like the skill sets, understanding people's psychology, what makes people tick. I'm constantly reading back through. There's a set of kind of play cards that were developed a few years ago by a German psychologist around kind of workplace, but it was called the 77 Human Needs. And that really is a really interesting kind of set of insights around what makes people tick and why do people want to do things that they want to do and what is it they're looking to try and get out of that. And I think whilst they're not all directly related to kind of workplace, they're just really around human needs. Like we need water, we need light, we need heat, we need clothing, we need human connection, we need love, and all these types of things. I think that all of those things start to build a really good understanding, and that's really effectively what we've used as the backbone to kind of build out our personas, and then adding in the workplace piece off the back of that. So I think like there's nothing sure has changed, right? Like, the things are going to keep changing and we've got to keep adapting. I remember my grandfather telling me when I was a child, like, there's nothing sure as death, taxes and change. And what he said basically is we're all going to die. We're all going to have to pay taxes at some point, and actually change happens whether you like it or not. So it's better to embrace it and go with it rather than fight it, because ultimately it's going to happen. And if you don't embrace it, you'll just get left behind. And you can definitely see that. Like I'm already looking at like doing these kind of what they call micro learning now. So I'm constantly looking at short courses where I can learn about kind of data analytics, data visualization, AI implementation. What does that mean? Like not just for my own role and for what we do, but also how can that be applied to other organizations? And then when we're talking to people, particularly in the change management space, people are very fearful of change. And it's just making sure that if you understand what those changes might mean for those people or what's going on in the workspace, you can actually bring some kind of calmness there to their concerns and help them address those challenges and concerns. Because quite often, I don't think AI is going to replace a huge amount of people's roles. It's going to streamline, it's definitely going to take some repetitive tasks away. But what we're seeing again with the Singapore government initiatives, that they're really looking to see how they can kind of redevelop, reskill, and everybody's got skills that can cross different roles and different activities. And it's just helping people to identify those and understand that that like this isn't the sort of robots are not going to suddenly pop up next year and take everybody's roles. It's just not going to happen.
Now, on a lighter note, Simon, I hear you make a mean Yorkshire pudding. That's your hometown specialty, isn't it? How does one go about making a delicious Yorkshire pudding?
Wow. I think I've never been able to do it here in Singapore. I think there's 2 things. One is it's difficult to get the oven hot enough. Typically here in Singapore, most ovens are electric rather than gas. But then secondly, also the humidity. So when you're mixing the batter here, the humidity really doesn't help with that. But I think if I was doing it back home, mixing the batter, letting it like rest for a couple of hours, getting the fat super hot, and then you pour it in and then put it in the oven. But I think like to make it delicious, for me, it would be, it's a savory kind of starter, or it would be part of the main meal with like a Sunday roast. And I would usually have it with kind of like a onion gravy, or maybe if you wanted a bit of a French twist on it, then you would maybe put in some kind of whole grain mustard into there with a red wine kind of sauce. Our friends over in Lancashire, which is just sort of a bit over the hill from where I used to live, they would typically do it as more of a sweet, and they would have it with jam, and they would typically have it cold rather than hot. So, but we're happy that they're enjoying it as well.
I look forward to sampling your Yorkshire pudding at some point in time, Simon.
Yeah.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Simon, for joining us. You can join us every month for a new episode of Savills Shares, the podcast on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, and Spotify. Till then, blessed day ahead. This podcast is for general information only and should not be taken as professional advice. Savills accept no responsibility or liability for any direct or indirect or any consequential loss from the use of, reference to, or the reliance on this podcast or its content.